Howdy, everyone. Great to see you again. Thanks very much for joining us once again on the Omohundro Institute's Digital Humanities Coffee House. I'm Jim Ambuske of George Mason University, joined as always by Martha Howard of the Omohundro Institute. And we've got another great program and lineup for you today. I'm very excited to have a project with a long genealogical lineage that dates back to the early days of digital history, and that is the Slave Voyages project. And with us to discuss that project today is Alex Borucki, who is professor of history at the University of California, Irvine. He is the author of, among many things, From Shipmates to Soldiers, Emerging Black Identities in the Rio de la Plata in 2015, and he is the co-creator with Greg O'Malley of the Intra-American Slave Trade database hosted by the website Slave Voyages, of which he is part of the team running the site, and Daniel B. Domingues, who is an associate professor of history at Rice University, which is also the university hosting slavevoyages.org, and he is also the editor of Slavery and Abolition's annual bibliographic supplement. In addition to that, he is also the author of The Atlantic Slave Trade from West Central Africa, 1780 to 1867, published by Cambridge University Press. Danielle, Alex, we're delighted to have you, and the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Martha and Jim, for the invitation. I guess this is the second time I participate in the OI's coffee house. Uh, Alex and I have a short PowerPoint presentation, then we can go straight to Q&A if you like. All right, fantastic. Well, slavevoyages.org, that's our information there. So for those who are new to the project, Slave Voyages, what is it? It is a pioneer in the digital humanities. In fact, when we started, we didn't even know that term digital humanities. We discovered that we were a digital humanities project after the fact. It is the largest database of slaving voyages available to the public for free at slavevoyages.org. That has been our URL since 2008. It is currently hosted at Rice University. It was previously based at Emory University. It's powered by the Oracle for Research and sustained by a consortium of institutions. The images that you see there changing in the GIF file are of the several pages of our website. We keep track of our statistic users, about a little over 600,000 users access the website on an annual basis. The numbers that I have here are from 2024. Almost 600,000 are new users. That suggests that most of our users are students, school children, college students. We have almost 3 million pages views per year in a little over a million sessions, right? And I don't know exactly what's happening here in Central Africa, right? But as you can see from the map, everybody around the world uses or accesses slavevoyages.org, right? To search for information on the history of the transatlantic slave trade, of the intra-American slave trade, and so on. The remote origins of the project dates to the late 1960s. The pioneer was Philip Curtin, who donated part of his research on the slave trade to start the transatlantic slave trade database. And his data was in the format of IBM, Fortran, punch cards like these you see here, right? So he initiated a database of voyages focused on the early 19th century. And with that information, he was able to compute some very interesting statistics on the slave trade and publicize in the form of maps and graphs like those you see here on on this slide, right? So we absorbed his database into what would become the transatlantic slave trade database. In fact, the first 2,000 records of voyages in the transatlantic slave trade database, you know, come straight from his IBM punch cards. Right, the first 2,000 voyages in our database originated from this data set that he used. The more recent history of the database dates from the early 1990s, when a group of historians got together to combine Philip Curtin's as well as other databases that they were individually compiling, and other researchers were also working on. So they combined all those together in a huge master file, if you will, that became known as the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. And they published that database electronically for the first time in 1999 as a CD-ROM. It was published by Cambridge University Press. It cost around $190, right? If it sounds expensive now, imagine back then, right? And then because it was so expensive, and because we were worried about preserving and publicizing it into the future, a newer generation of researchers organized a website to deploy the database there and make it accessible to the public, right? So that's the first online iteration, right, of Slave Voyages. It came out in 2008 at the current URL on slavevoyages.org. This is more or less how it looked like when it first came out. Maybe some of you have seen it. Right? And made accessible the database, estimates of the transatlantic slave trade as well, some images, names of Africans rescued from slave ships, right? And a bunch of visualization tools like graphs, tables, maps, even. Later on in 2019, we deployed a new version, fully redesigned. That's the version that is currently accessible to the public. We added new features like the Intra-American Slave Trade Database has been added to the site, right? The time lapse was published in 2017, so a little bit before that, but we were able to enhance it, right? A 3D video of the ship Lahore. It's a French ship. So no more interesting features there for folks to navigate in a fully redesigned and updated website. And in 2021, a group of institutional organizations, universities, museums, they got together, formed a consortium to sustain the site into the future, and the management of the site moved to Rice University, where I'm based. I've been the host of the project since 2021, and I work together with two committees, a steering committee and an operational committee. Professor Borucki here, he sits at both committees, and we work together to maintain the site for the public and into the future. The consortium was originally formed by 6 institutions. The Alejandro Institute of Early American History was one of the founding institutions of the consortium, along with Rice, Emory, Harvard, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the University of California system. Later on, 4 other institutions joined the consortium. So Washington University in St. Louis, the Fluminense Federal University in Brazil, University of Glasgow, and the University of the West Indies, the Cape View campus in Barbados. So we have 3 international institutional members in the consortium, right? So we are a total of about 10 organizations at this point sustaining the site. And we've been able to accomplish a lot of things since 2021. Here's a list of some of them. We organized a couple of international conferences, more than a couple actually at this point. We transitioned the site to Rice, new environment. So it was previously the Amazon World Service, and now it's Oracle for Research. We extended our institutional membership. right? We started organizing or assembling the project's archives at Frondren Library here at Rice University. We launched a rotational postdoctoral fellowship so we can train a newer generation of scholars into the history and the ins and outs of managing slave voyages, right? And we have secured funding from funding agencies to help further develop the project, right? Different projects associated with slave voyages, right? Including the Inter-American Slave Trade Database, but also forthcoming the Indian Ocean Asian Slave Trade Database, which will be integrated momentarily into slave voyages. And the project has had lots of impacts. Just very quickly, of course, scholarly. It is widely cited. We ourselves produce books and articles of using the website. If you see the numbers here at the bottom, Google Books doesn't give the count anymore, but in 2023, about 11,600 publications cited slavevoyages.org, right? And this year on Google Scholar, which focuses on articles, right, slave voyage is cited by 4,870 articles, more or less, right? So it has a huge impact in academic publications, right, in scholarly work. Art in the art world also, artists use the website to get inspired and produce their artworks. We have here two installations, one by Sue William in Basel, called Messages from the Atlantic Passage, uh, which she has these bottles connected by chains and lifted from water tanks, and the bottles have inscriptions with the names of the ships, the dates, and she gets all that information from slave voyages, right? And on this other side here, we have a data sculpture made with beads representing the statistics within the slave voyages data set, right? This exhibition really hits home when you learn that beads was a currency in the period of the transatlantic slave trade. So it is very interesting. And also impacts in community engagement. One project that I like to highlight, it's called Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers. And what they do, they check the website for ports involved in the transatlantic slave trade and then work with community organizations and the government of these places to erect signs or markers like the one you see here on the screen. And they organize a ceremony, right, once they launch the site, showing that this is a place involved in the history of the transatlantic slave trade. So this ceremony is kind of help bring people some closure, right, some regarding the impacts of the slave trade in their communities, right? So it's a pretty nice project, and they rely on slave voyages to locate these ports and work on their request to raise the marker. And of course, educational impacts, teachers, professors, research centers, they all use slave voyages for instruction, right? To teach on the history of the African diaspora, history of slavery, the slave trade. These are some pictures of actually my own students here at Rice University, using slave voyages and presenting new research on slave voyages. So uh, this is what I want to show as an intro for our discussion. Alex and I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much for that overview. And the longevity of the project raises a number of questions I think we're going to have a fun time discussing, including one actually that Janet raises in the chat. And I'll just go ahead and read it if that's okay, because it's a really good one and it speaks to something you said, Daniel. Did discovering this project, that it was part of the digital humanities after it had long started, did that change your approach in later work? And if so, how?
There were two things. Not only that it was a digital humanities project, the new thing, while the previous generation of us did it, but it was also a public history project. The two things combined. Initially, David Richardson, Eltis, Klein, and Steve Berenhen thought the database as something to collaborate with other scholars. That was what launched making the CD-ROM into a website, making possible for other scholars to contribute data and update the database, meaning that the database was alive. It was not fixed on a CD-ROM, but it was able to change it over time, particularly from data that came from outside of the United States or outside of the English-speaking scholarly universe, from Portuguese language archives, Spanish language archives, and other archives around the world, and also another scholars around the world. That was the switch to the public digital part, which was among scholars only. Let's say that it was thought in that way, but it was users who make this a public history initiative. And we know that because usually, for instance, when there is something wrong that is not working on the database, a lot of times is teachers, like professors in other universities or in high schools, that send us an email to the user email saying, oh, these things that I used to work with my students is not working, and that's how we know that it works. But also it has forced us, the people managing the site, to think about a community of users, which involve different groups of people who engage the database in different areas. For instance, in a university classroom, in a high school classroom, in the K-12 environment, genealogists, people who are working for trying to find a specific person, and so on, and communities of descendants as well. Yeah.
As you're thinking about that, though, one of the things I was really thinking about is this project, at least the digital or the web version, so to speak, will be 20 years old soon. Most digital humanities projects, they get set up, they're sustained for 5 years, you declare victory and go home. How do you keep this going over this course? What does it take to ensure the sustainability and the continued evolution and the growth of a project like this?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that has been the preoccupation of the researchers involved in this project for decades now, right? I mean, it requires, of course, resources, funding. It requires knowledge, a lot of knowledge, right? You got to be familiar with the database in order to maintain it, right? And engagement, right? So engagement with academia, engagement with the public, right? Students and so on. So those are the things that that require, and you have to be sensitive to technological transformations, right? We moved online because researchers at the time, they understood that CD-ROMs, they are not going to be here for very long, right? And if you notice, we don't have any CD-ROM port anymore in your computers, right? So they knew that, as their predecessors knew that punch cards, were going to be obsolete, as the magnetic tape, expanded, and then the same thing when the floppy disks came, right, and so on. So we got to be sensitive to technological changes.
I made that to that there is something of a balance between creating a group that assures the sustainability of the project, and on the other side, having different research groups or research communities that work on development, on expanding the project. And this is something that you have to think beyond individualistic conceptions of the self, in the sense that you are working for things that academically are good for you, and I say that as a faculty person, but also are good for others. So we have to be less selfish about our, but contribute to a greater good, which is the expansion of knowledge and the sustainability of using this type of tool. It's a kind of delicate balance that we do strive to make our own progress, but also the progress of different research communities involved on that. And that changes over time. There may be some people that at some point it's very engaged with working with the database and with the workings behind the scenes of the database, with the backstage of how things work. And sometimes people leave and some others come, That also relates to the issue of how these projects have the initiative of creating postdoctoral fellowships from the different institutions that are involved in the consortium, like the Omohundro, the Hutchins in Harvard, or us here in the University of California system, that we can provide that kind of pipeline for people to engage more on the project and then either go in their own way or staying working with the team.
I'm highly sympathetic to the CD-ROM because I remember as a kid when Encyclopedia Encarta came out, and I thought it's never going to get better than this. And then that was demolished in about 2 years after that. But Alex, to your point about institutional knowledge and preservation of knowledge, as you're creating knowledge about the past and about the people who were forced to undertake these voyages, then how do you ensure the continuity of knowledge about the project itself so that, as you say, thinking beyond the self, that in later years when, in 25, 30 years when this project is still going, what kind of protocols are in place to ensure that the people who come after you are able to look back, see what you've done on the project, either to fix something that's broken, or a piece of Python code that's gone wrong, if we're still using Python in 20, 25 years, or or to imagine the next iteration of the project.
Yeah. So what we do is we train students, we foster community, as Alex mentioned earlier. We have our postdoctoral fellowship program going, right? So we've got to always be in touch with folks and transmit the knowledge and also support them in their research, right? So they can in the future. Find jobs, establish themselves, their reputation, and hopefully be in a position, to take the torch, right?
And to add to that, there is also like a parallel system of documentation regarding decisions. Daniel, like the Google Drive with all the files of the old stuff. There are some hard files that currently are there in Rice.
We do. We do have like we have an archive here. Uh, we all share electronic files on a cloud service, right? Like Dropbox, Google Drive. So we have that, and we also save copies of our database and in Harvard's Dataverse, for example. Right, we take advantage of new opportunities too, like for example, the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, where you can publish an article, updates about your project, and they will save a file of the data that you're exploring in that article. So we've done that too. So we leave traces, right, that other researchers can then pick up and follow, right, if they want to.
That's great. We got several more questions here, and actually one that I think builds on this. Martha, did you want to ask about next technological innovations?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you foresee any kind of role for AI, either directly in the build of the project or the way the project rolls out, or as scholars, just in reading manifests and the sort of the raw data that comes into the database.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be inevitable, right? Because of the pace of the technological innovation, folks will want to experiment with AI and see how things look, right? But we don't currently use AI, But we've been discussing about using machine learning and possibly AI uh, to bridge the gaps, right, in the database, right? We have our own systems of imputing information, right? They're very complex. I hate them myself, right? So if there's a technological innovation that can help us with that, from my part, I will gladly welcome it, right? But we do keep things separate, right? We have a conjunction, right, of variables, if you will, that we call data variables. And that's what we find in the archives, in the documents. And those are, we don't touch them, right? That's what we find. That's what is given, right, by the primary sources. And then we have another set, right, variables that we call imputed variables. And that's where we do these sorts of projections, experimentations with machine learning, AI, and so on, right? So when we apply these technologies that will help us bridge the gaps in the archives, in the information, we use the imputed variables to explore them. Those and the estimates, right, that we generate ourselves. So we are able to tell fiction or projection from reality, right?
I may add that there are some parts that now, with the new iteration of the new user interface that's going to be launched at some point this year in hard landing, you guys, Daniel, and the project of the South Sea Company papers have been using AI in the forms of transcribing documents, right?
Yeah, we are currently developing a project where we use automated transcriptions, right? That is more of a machine learning, right, than actual AI. So we've we selected a sample of an archive, and that's the archives of the British South Sea Company, and we have ourselves transcribe a sample of these documents, and then we taught the machine to see if it is this word, right, or this letter. No, it should be this word or this letter in the transcription, right, in the modern transcription. And then the machine applies that, right, to the huge archive of images that we've or documents that we digitize, right? So that's automated transcriptions. We are using that for the first time. It's not publicly available yet, but it'll be very soon, right? So folks can do keyword searches, right, in documents.
And to add that to that question of the imputed data, meaning the things that we estimate regarding specific slave voyages, but also the whole estimates of the transatlantic slave trade, which is different than the database of individual slave voyages. We think that in the future we should apply to the National Science Foundation, if the National Science Foundation still exists in the future, in order to do a revamping of this process of imputing data from an individual slave voyage, meaning regarding the geography, the timeline, the number of enslaved people in that individual slave voyages, if you were missing that part, but also doing a new estimates of the whole transatlantic slave trade based on the known data. And just to give you an example, if you go to the database of individual slave voyages and you search for the first century of the transatlantic slave trade, mainly going to Spanish America, that gives you a specific number of individual slave voyages and people crossing the Atlantic from Africa. But if you go to the database of the estimates, meaning what is estimated from that gives you a smaller number, because those estimates were made in 2008, 2010, and they have been not updated since then. The database of individual voyages is dynamic, meaning that it's evolving through time as new people add new information, but the other one is not. So we have to find a way to do that. But of course, we cannot do everything all the time at the same time. We're humans, not robots. So this has to be something for the future.
Speaking of the future, I think this actually brings in Simon's question very well about future work and how we can take inspiration from this project. Simon, do you want to pop in?
Sure. I'm just, as a huge fan of the site and the resource, which I use all the time in all of my work, I am struck by how some of the historiography recently, people like Hartman, Smallwood, Fuentes, talk about the violence of the archive and how enumeration of enslaved people seems to perpetuate that violence. And I think your resource has done a good job of engaging with that, with something like the slave names aspect. But how do you see going forward dealing with that way in which, as Fuentes puts it, how do we redress the ongoing violence of slavery's archive? Because this is a resource that is premised on that archive and its violence.
Yeah, absolutely. So and thank you very much for using the site and for your kind words about the work that we've been doing, right? We've always known that the archives that we use, the sources that we use, they were generated and predicated in a system of oppression, violence, right, exploitation. That's when these scholars announced this to the public. I mean, we were already very familiar with it. Our philosophy, right, at the time was we're using this to recover, right, the history and the lives of these individuals who were subjected onto the systems of violence and oppression. We wanted to make them visible, right, in the archives and elsewhere, right. So we try to balance or counterbalance the violent nature of the documents by using some of the things that you mentioned, right? Having the names of the individuals forced onto the slave ships, right? We have a list. Our list now has over 90,000 records, but that's really just a tiny fraction, right, of what was the transatlantic slave trade. Unfortunately, most documents, they in most archives, they don't have any details about the names or other personal information about the individuals forced onto the slave ships, right? But we try the best we can to compile those and make them available to the public, right? Other things that we do, we have our graphs, our maps, right? The time lapse, that's always very moving. A lot of people write to us and expressing how moved they were about seeing the time lapse with the ships, moving across the ocean, right? The videos, the 3D videos we've done, we have three now, two now available. So those are some of the things that we do, right? And reach out to communities, working with genealogists, or just members of the public, right? We get frequent telephone calls or emails, asking for help to identify a ship, a voyage, a person, and we answer, right? We have a listserv, we have an email, an address that folks write and reach many researchers involved in the project at the same time, right? And oftentimes one of us is able to reply and help individuals in tracing their families or finding information they are interested, right? So community engagement is important for us. So those are some of the things that we do to counterbalance, right? The violence of the archives.
Thank you. And I think the work that artists do in response to your research is another area that humanizes and brings back the humanity. So thank you.
Yeah, yes, artists they use as a source of inspiration, right? To create their own artworks. Sometimes they send images or pictures, right, of their artwork to us. That's super nice. Also, museums use it and they create their own exhibitions, materials, based on the information available in the database. So I think, it's hard to say whether that's working or not, right? I like to think it is working, right? I see it as a positive response, right? Our work is also used by the news media, by the policymakers, non-government organizations, activists, especially those who want to claim reparations for the slave trade, right? So they access our statistics in order to further support their claims, their demands, right? So
I may add that one of the artists that Daniel mentioned, April Fraser, she's based in Texas, and part of her work has been developed so to help with the redesign of the site. So when in the new site, when you go to the part of enslavers and enslaved, that part is inspired in her design, right, Daniel?
yeah, that's correct. So we also invite artists to come and provide us advice on how things should look right on this site. And sometimes they provide direct interventions, right? And we are trying to accommodate those as best as we can, right?
And this has been marvelous dialogues.
Yeah.
You have a lot of moving parts and a lot of moving pieces and a lot of institutional partners and a lot of community partners with this project. And actually, I think Amy, if you're inclined to ask your question about project management, because I think it's a good one about how you keep a good balance of all of these different pieces.
Yeah, just knowing that some of the folks who are in the more the technology side can have demands or requests that are at odds with the project. But like, how do you, yeah, just project management. How do you
Yeah. That's
keep everyone happy?
it's mission impossible. It's constant work
No.
in progress.
Remember that time, that conference that we did in Emory, that there was a session that there were all the librarians that helped to put the first iteration of Slave Voyages, the website, on there. And they all agree on one thing. And to have like 4 different librarians agree on one thing for different areas was like, whoa, that this project had to be in the hands of faculty, not university administrators, not the librarians themselves, but the people who are the specialists on creating this knowledge in that sense. And with that, we have developed some kind of, how to put it, a double mistaken identity. Sometimes we repeat things twice to make sure they understand us, and they repeat things twice to make sure we understand them as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's a challenge. It's a challenge, especially now that the project has grown and there are so many different communities with a stake in it, involved or interested. The tech people, they are more always very conservative. They are the ones who oftentimes impose limitations or restrictions, right, in our ability to create and show interesting things, right? Just because of the limitations of technology, right? It's not because they are being Debbie Downers or any of that.
And they don't want to break the site. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
my
they don't want to
husband's a
break
software
or
engineer, so there's always concerns about breaking things. It's part of
yeah.
the process, but
They just don't have the same kind of liberty an artist has, right, in creating, right? I mean, artists they're free to create, and that's what they want to be, right? That's their natural and preferred state, right? It's total freedom, right? And but technology, unfortunately, it doesn't have the same kind of freedom, right? So sometimes artists or scholars, they want to do something different or show things in a different manner, and then the programmers, right, would say, "I know we can do this, but we cannot do that." So for this time around, I organized a workshop. I invited artists. I invite programmers too, but I prohibited the programmers to speak. Right? They were not allowed to speak because once they speak, saying, "Oh no, you can't do that," that's a really it generates it kind of
Bad energy.
Yeah, bad energy, right? It kinds of kills the momentum, right? So to speak. So they were not allowed to speak, and I inserted an intermediary, right? Architects or architecture students, right? And then I charge the architect students to listen to the artists, to the communities, the researchers, right? And work out a design book, so how things should look like, and then they would present that to the programmers, right? So the programmers could work some of the suggestions of the communities, artists, researchers without like killing the mood, right? So yeah, so well, I think it worked, but I will find out only after we publish the the new version, right?
But also the people in tech have made us realize some things that were a little bit not so responsible on our part. For instance, documenting how the input modes are made, how we impute from the data that we know to the data that we don't know. Or for instance, in the back end of the website, you have information about the individual slave voyage, but we don't have like a historical record of how that individual slave voyage information changed by different users. We have only the end result, but not the different iterations. And some of the tech people are horrified that we don't have that with good reason. And our plan is to be able to track the changes on the back end that had happened to an individual slave voyage.
So, and we still have plenty of time for questions if anybody else has any. So please do raise your hand or pop them in the chat. But I'll ask a kind of big question here as we're nearing the end of our hour, which is, you've talked a lot about community engagement, bringing on new institutional partners. As we kind of kicked off with this discussion today, this is a very long running project. So, what excites you next? What are the things that you're looking forward to in this project? Where do you want to see it go in the next few years?
Well, we have two active or three, right? Active research grants. I want to finish them. One of them has to do with adding the Indian Ocean and parts of maritime Asia into the slave voyages data set. So we will be able also to compare the traffic in that part of the globe with the transatlantic and an intra-American one. Right, we have almost a little over, a year left on that grant. Right, the other grant I'm very excited is the one that is doing the work with the British South Sea Company. So the goal there is actually not just be able to transcribe the document, right? The primary goal is to be able to connect the records of voyages and individuals on the database to images of documents available in the websites of their original repositories, right? So someone could click on a voyage and then click on the source of that voyage, source of information of that voyage, and go and see the document right in front of them. But we don't want to host the document. We want just to link it now to the original repository's website. So that will allow us to connect slave voyages to libraries and archives around the world, right? So that's what we want to do. I'm very excited about this. We have a pilot going with the British Library, the Huntington Library, Clements Library, the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration, right? Going and with a project based in Germany called Price Papers. So I'm very excited about this one. Right, and the third grant we have is from folks there in California. Alex, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah. We have a grant from the Office of the President of University of California system that goes into enlarging different parts of the intra-American slave trade database, but also helping other projects more focused on the Pacific. You know, California is in the Pacific. California was also Mexico as well. So this project goes into 3 different areas. One is incorporating slave voyages on the Pacific Ocean of the Spanish Americas, from Panama to Peru, from Chile to Peru, from Panama into Mexico. And this has involved speaking with other communities of scholars in Chile, in Peru, in Colombia, in Mexico as well. That's one part. Another part is increasing the coverage of the intra-American slave trade database on the Caribbean. That's the part that Greg O'Malley is leading. And the other part is the Mexican part, which is helping a group of Mexican scholars in Mexico to create a database of the movement of individual enslaved people within New Spain, within La América Mexicana, basically from Guatemala almost to Oregon, and tracking that movement of people based mostly on the work of individual scholars who have worked on sales of enslaved people, notarial records. Notarial records are huge in Spanish America. It's one of the bases of the colonial archive in Spanish America. And so you have a historian of Guerrero, a historian of Oaxaca, a historian of Puebla. The thing is, putting all these people together, started to work and share their data, create a consolidated database that track the movement of individuals within this larger Mexico area during the colonial period. We are on a test site right now, and we hope to launch this next year. I'm gonna make a case that for all these digital projects, one of the things that it's something under the radar that you have to create, apart from the technical, the historian, and all the other scholarly interactions, is trust. And trust cannot start from beginning. You trust people after you work with people, and all these projects have developed over time as also a way to develop trust among collaborative research. Yeah.
And then the last thing is deploying the newly redesigned site, right? And if you want, I can give you a quick peek of it.
Sure, we love previews.
Reviews it is, okay. So this will be the homepage of the forthcoming version of the Slave Voyages website. And there will be a search bar here. Folks can search for ship names, places, documents, so on. Here you have other features highlighted. Right. Over here you have the Voyages database, the transatlantic, the intra-American, and we having an interface for all voyages. Right. Indian Ocean will be added here later. And then a page for people, right. Enslaved, enslavers, including all enslaved people. Same thing for enslavers, right? Organized by trades, transatlantic, intra-American, and all trades. Time lapse will be here. We're gonna add layers for folks. These are gonna be new features. We have our blogging platform. And then the documents will be here. You can click on a document. It's linked to voyages and people. Right. These images being streamed straight from the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration is not on our servers. No.
Which we thank the National Archives.
Thank the National Archives, and they're getting the hits and the credits, of course. Right.
Well, I think a good way to end this discussion is with this sneak peek of the future of while we're studying the past. So thank you, Daniel and Alex, very much. This has been great. And we look forward to these exciting new developments. And everyone should go check out your excellent work.
Thank you very much. No, it's been a pleasure to share some of our work here with you guys.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. This has been great seeing you and your questions as well. I hope we were useful.
Most definitely. Take care, everybody. We'll see you in a couple weeks.